And we're back. This is the Catholic Lady, and we're reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. And we are on Chapter 3, Part 2. And I have to tell you, I have two boxers, and they are being pests right now. So I apologize for any interruptions, but I will try to make it through this segment. It was autumn in the garden and very hot in the afternoon. The restless palms themselves were still, and the cypresses and the sycamores and the carob trees had taken on themselves a more shining darkness as the year waned, and the sky was a hard and brilliant turquoise, against which the distant mountains, scarlet threaded with green, leaned and tumbled in their grotesque shapes. The valley had deepened to the ripeness of the days, the grass a heavier green, the fields bronze with harvest. And Tarsus, the city, spreading on the banks of the waters, now a flashing purple, revealed with clarity the whiteness of its walls, or their rose, or blue, or yellow, and their red roofs. Birds were already circling like feathered wheels in the sky, preparing for long flight. And the figs were ripe on the trees in Hillel's gardens, and there was a scent of grapes in the humid air, and golden dust and water. The year was dying, thought Aristo, but in death apparently there is a last affirmation of life. He looked at the gaily striped awnings scattered over the garden, at the cool grottos, at the shining whiteness of the graceful statues, at the shimmering pond on which circled the black and white swans, preening, and the ludicrous Chinese ducks, who took themselves so seriously and were therefore belligerent. The little bridge over the pond was reflected sharply in the motionless water below. A young girl stood there on the arch, looking down. She was clad in a very short tunic, as green as the pond, and her golden hair blazed in the sun. Pardon me. Sorry about that. Let's try this again. The fountains were scintillating in the too vivid light, and appeared to throw up long streamers, like reaching arms or hands, or the tossings of shaking locks. Aristo and Saul sat beneath one of the awnings, and they were sweating freely. A plate of fresh fruit stood on a rude rustic table, and Aristo picked up a plum and thoughtfully devoured it. His rough black hair was rougher with patches of gray now, but his Greek body was still lithe and thin, and his narrow face was dark with the sun, and his nose was sharp and inquisitive, and his eyes ever seeking. He looked at Saul, and recalled that Deborah Bathsheba considered her son hideous. Aristo shook his head in silent denial. The boy might not be of impressive stature, but his body was strong and well sculptured and broad, and even the bowed legs added to that impression of vigorous strength. To Aristo, he was like some primitive fire god with that raised and crested mane of intensely red hair, with those red eyebrows almost meeting above his eyes, and the virile low forehead and the pointed ears. A young Vulcan, perhaps, thought Aristo, or Heracles, though certainly not a Hermes, for there was no lightness about Saul ben Hillel, no soft grace or elegance, but only an aura of power. Power, above all, was to be reverenced, for it had in it a terrible beauty of its own, reflected the Greek. An appalling magnetism, something that could inspire fear, but was also irresistible. Even Saul's features, the wide, thin lips, the great nose, the hard, firm chin, spoke of power, though the boy, at this moment, was stuffing his mouth with handfuls of grapes and licking his fingers, which ran with winy juices. When Saul spoke, one listened, even if not desirous of listening, for he had a deep and vigorous voice, with a curious weight and emphasis to the syllables, an emphatic pronunciation, and an echoing timbre. One could not call it a musical voice, but never, Even when he was excited, did it resemble a girl's, nor had it been a girl's voice even before it had changed to the deeper sound of a man's. Though Saul, in a very plain tunic of gray linen with no embroidery on it, sat apparently at his ease in his chair, and was engrossed in devouring the fruit with gusto, he did not give the appearance of being composed or at peace. All his unruly and impetuous nature asserted itself in the ever-changing contour of his face, in the jerking of his eyebrows, in the quickness of his hands, and the tightness of his shoulder muscles. His hands were browned by the sun, and the nails pale on the short, broad fingers, the fingers of a soldier, and his arms were large and muscular and sunburned. He wore the ring his father had given him when he had become a man, according to the Jewish traditions, and it was set with a ruby as fiery as his hair, and the gold was plain and unornamented. Hillel had known his son, thought Aristo, and had chosen what best expressed him. To the Greek, Saul had a forceful and cogent beauty of his own, which in full maturity might become frightful and intimidating. He set down his strong arched feet with purpose and certainty, and he could move rapidly. Had he height, thought Aristo, who had more affection for his pupil than anyone ever suspected except Hillel, he would be a veritable Titan. Then an odd following thought came to him. Saul of Tarsus was indeed a Titan, though but 14 as yet. The superstitious Greek, who denounced all superstition as unworthy of an enlightened man, seemed to glimpse the future when Saul would walk among men with authority and even with terror, hurling that voice of his into the face of multitudes. In that obscure cataract and caves and mountains of heredity had this prodigy wrought and drunk his being. The gentle and handsome Hillel, the lovely Deborah, were very unlikely parents of this man-child, and Deborah was very petulant on the subject even before the youth himself. He was violent. He was never savage or mean or vengeful. He was disputatious, but he was never insulting, nor did he jibe at his adversary. He took an idea and elaborated on it, or figuratively mangled and tore it apart, but always objectively, with no malice and no scorn. Ideas of others might exasperate him, but never to denunciations of the other's intelligence. He was always, he declared, being misunderstood. It seemed to him that it was not too much to ask to be comprehended, even if one disagreed with him. Saul, Saul, thought Aristo the Greek, the world will not edify you, nor will it receive you kindly. Men like Saul might evoke a holocaust, but they were usually devoured with it. Aristo hoped this would not happen to Saul, though he had his fears. Therefore he tried to temper that vociferous disposition, to quiet the rushing assaults of speech when they became too bursting, to instill in Saul that golden mien which was the mark of a cultivated man. The world was full of timid men. They did not like boldness in others, for it seemed to threaten them. In particular, they hated and feared men who demanded that they pursue an argument logically to its conclusion and use reason. It was into this world, thought Aristo, with unusual sorrow, that this Jewish Hector had been born, all passion but no baseness, all honor but no malvolence, all duty, alas, but no frivolity. The world would not love him, therefore the gods must, and that is more dangerous. The figs are very ripe and sweet, Aristo, said Saul, noticing, with that sharp clarity of eye for which he was distinguished, and the mournful expression on his tutor's antic face. Eat this, which is the largest and is covered with its own honey. He put the fig into Aristo's fingers, and Aristo ate it abstractedly. "Pigs," said a laughing voice near them as they ate under the striped awnings. They looked up to see a young girl who had stood on the bridge. She smiled at them teasingly and threw back the mass of her golden hair in which the sunlight danced. Her eyes, almost as golden, mocked their male gorging of the fruit. Her exceedingly pretty face, fair as a lily and as translucent, was rosy from the heat of the day, and her pert nose was burned. Her eyes were hardly less golden than her hair, and her pretty mouth was always smiling, or if a grave thought flitted across her mind, the expression of her lips might change to seriousness, which, however, appeared to be instantly about to depart. A year younger than her brother, Saul, and only 13, she was taller, and her breasts were delicately nubile under the thin stuff of her short green tunic. While Saul was as restless as a young bull, Sephora was as restless as a flower in a summer breeze. One moment. Again, apologies. It's that kind of day, or I should say that time of day. She was already espoused to her cousin Ezekiel in Jerusalem, and would marry him on her 14th birthday, for she had reached puberty 6 months ago. "That tunic," said Saul, "is lewd and shameless for one of your age, an espoused woman, a modest Jewish maiden." The girl glanced down at her long, fair legs below the hem of the tunic. "Bah," she said, "who is concerned with modesty in this garden? The day is hot, too hot even for a chiton," and her legs gleamed like marble touched by the sun. She bounced under the awning and seized a citron and tore off its skin and sank her white teeth into the pulp. Her merry eyes surveyed them. The juice of the fruit ran down her chin, and she licked at it with her red tongue. "I am thinking of not marrying Ezekiel," she said, and thrust her hand again between Aristo and Saul and took a plum. She pretended to study it. Her Greek accent was pure and sweet, for Aristo had taught her himself, whereas her father had taught her Aramaic and enough Hebrew as was prudent to teach a girl. It was only when looking at Sephora that Saul's eyes lost their metallic gleam and became almost soft. He spoke disapprovingly. "It is not fitting for a maiden of your age to display herself in a boy's tunic. Where is our mother, that she permits this?" "It is not a boy's tunic," said Sephora. "It's mine. A year ago, my legs became longer." She spat out the seed of the plum. Her feet moved to inaudible music. "I think I am really a nymph," she said. While Saul had been taught much of the Greek gods by Aristo during their classical studies, he did not consider it proper that his sister should know of their lascivious beauty and their adulteries, and so he gave Aristo a glance of umbrage. But Aristo was studying the pretty girl child with pleasure. "I think so also," he replied. "Shameless," said Saul. "Your knees have been bitten by mosquitoes, unbecoming for a girl. They are also dirty. Have you been crawling in mud, my sister?" "Do I ask you where you go secretly in the mornings when it is a hardly dawn?" asked the maiden, reaching for a bunch of grapes. Saul, to Aristo's surprise, colored deeply, and even his pink ears turned red. Sephora laughed at him. "It must be to visit a girl, a shepherdess, perhaps, or a goose girl, or a herder of goats," she said. She shook a finger at him, a slender finger running with juices. "Shameless indeed. You steal from the house when it is hardly light, and only I see you, and put my pillow over my face to muffle my laughter. What damsel is it, sweet brother?" Aristo studied his pupil with amusement, for Saul's coloring was deepening moment by moment, and his face seemed to be swelling. The Greek took pity on him. Saul was incapable of lying, and a question would be answered by the truth, and it was obvious that he was dreading such a question. So Aristo said, "It is quite common for a youth Saul's age, full of dreams and fantasies and strange longings, to go out to view the dawn alone and to meditate." Sephora herself thought this was probably true of her brother, but she continued to tease him. "One morning I shall surely follow you," she said, "and discover the dryad in bulrushes." "You were thinking of Moses," said Saul, and his voice was a little thick. "And cease this talk of dryads and nymphs. Wash yourself and array yourself more modestly." "Old man," said Sephora, and ran off singing, her white legs flashing in the sun. "A divine maiden," said Aristo, "a veritable Atalanta." Saul shrugged. "She is but a chit. She has a tongue like an asp." They sat in silence, aware of what had not been said. And when they looked at each other again, it was as if they had made a compact between them, a compact of honor. Saul smiled. "I love her dearly," he said, "though she has no mind and is only a girl." They heard Sephora's airy singing near the pond, a blithe, light song that was no prayer of invocation, but came from her child's heart and her joy in life. Nevertheless, Aristo was taken by the melancholy, as if a precious interlude was coming to an end and would never be known in just such a fashion again. He imagined that a beautiful statue had turned and shown another face, and it was a more somber one. The distant mountains were already wearing thin rings of snow, and now, as the sun sank, the wind freshened and the awnings bellowed like sails. Saul, almost under his breath, began to chant that mournful and sorrowful song which Aristo knew presaged the coming Jewish high holidays and the solemn day of atonement, when Jews repent their sins, ask for forgiveness, and promise penance. Aristo thought, their deity is their own, and thank the gods they keep him. Saul's faint chanting suddenly seemed ominous to the Greek. He did not speak when Saul rose and went and bent head and returned to the house. Aristo watched him go. Something dusty and premonitory, but unknowable, passed like a harsh wing over his mind. To him, it was an omen.